sure that it's where I want it to be. Cool. Alright, and back to this. So we ended here last time, which wasn't the ideal spot to end for me, because it was kind of, there's still another like subsection before the end of this section in the book, but it's all right. This is talking about some issues happening due to land that the British took after the war, because actually I think I've got, yeah, this map, which again is why I like having images in particular maps. This is just a really good visual representation of the issues. There was this disputed territory that the British claimed was theirs and the French claimed was theirs, but I mean the French had always claimed that the Mississippi was the border anyway, so the French claiming this territory was, well, I mean the French and the British never got along, so regardless. And at least according to this, the point of the war was the Ohio River Valley. Now, the book never really goes into that, so that's never something we're going to worry too much about unless you want to like do a paper on the war, in which you could talk more about that if you want to. But one of the main things about wars, particularly back then, because today it's more about like stealing resources and stopping threats, big air quotes. Back then it was taking land from other countries, and soldiers weren't really paid well. So the idea was, if your side won and you took all this land from the enemy, that's land you can now settle. So if you fought for your country, if you fought for, say, England in this case, and especially if you were a British colonist and y'all won, and you now have all this land that's totally not occupied by natives, you are now not only like allowed to settle on it, but that's your prize for winning this war. You can go and settle on all this free open land, again, big air quotes, because that's how you made money back then. You would have a big farm and grow stuff and sell it, and that was the way to make money. That was the way to have a living. And that was the case for a while. So that was just the understood mindset was, oh, we're going to win this land and be able to make farms, because this was really good farming land out here. Unfortunately, as we've seen, there were lots of natives out there that didn't want the British there. I mean, they didn't want any of the Europeans there, but they had been getting along decently with the French, and to some extent with the Spanish. The Spanish were still having issues with the Seminoles. That was the native tribe that I had forgotten, that I couldn't remember, down here in Florida. The Seminoles were really strong. Andrew Genocide Jackson isn't able to push the Seminoles out of Florida. Like, it's not until after his term that the Seminoles are finally pushed out of Florida. So, yeah, they're really dug in there. Anyway, point being, Britain is attempting to, let's actually go back to this again real quick. Britain's attempting to keep the colonists out of these new regions, at least for a little while they settle things down. But of course, the colonists are pissed about that because, like, hey, we just fought a war for 7 years, hence the name, um, and now you won't let us settle the land that we won? That doesn't make sense. So, yeah. Then again, um, Veterans for Wars not being paid is also something we're going to see a lot of going forward. So, land disputes were common. This wasn't something that just happened because of the 7 Years' War, which again, I refuse to call the French and Indian War, but if you need to make that connection, that was the connection. That's the same war, but I don't call it that because that's a dumb name. This this went back to England to like the Middle Ages. When it came to landowners and tenants, they had this like feudal setup going, where the landowner, well, owned the land, and if you lived on the land, you had to pay rent, usually in a percentage of whatever you grew, and then it went from like a percentage to a set amount, and if you weren't able to grow that set amount that year, um, you'd be kicked off the land, and blah, blah, blah. It got very abusive very fast, and oftentimes, these tenants would rise up against the landlords and force them to treat the tenants better, because, landlords are parasites. And, yeah, I mean, and this is like the entire issue in Ireland, is the British, like, took over Ireland and were like, hey, you people that have been living here for generations, we now own it, and you now have to pay us to live here. And the Irish didn't take too kindly to that. So one such group was the Green Mountain Boys, led by Ethan Allen. This is a group you may be familiar with. They were pretty important early on in the Revolution, so we'll hear about them again. So they were up in New York, and they went up against landowners and land speculators, and claimed that the authorities had no legitimacy over, the land that they were attempting to rule over. Because it wasn't just like, and of course when I'm talking about New York, I mean New York, the state, or what would become the state, the colony. But like they were pushing well into like upstate New York, and just claiming all this land and what they thought it was worth, and charging people for living there that had been living there, as frontiersmen for a few generations by this point. And they weren't having it. And by not having it, I mean they had guns. The Green Mountain Boys weren't a group of guys that went into town and went up to the city council and petitioned that they shouldn't be bothered by these land speculators. They were dudes in the woods who knew how to fight. And if land speculators came out there and told them, hey, you owe us these taxes, the Green Mountain Boys said, hey, that's nice. We have muskets. Would you like the taxes in lead? Yeah, so there was another group, the regulators, not speculators, regulators led by Herman Hosbin, down in North Carolina, or I guess from here up in North Carolina. His group actually showed up before the Green Mountain Boys and inspired the Green Mountain Boys to form. And since they were in the western parts of their colonies, away from the larger cities on the coast, they would set up their own little local governments, popular courts. They basically made their own little towns, their own little governments, because living on the frontier, they had to deal with, again, the hostile natives, because just being there pissed off the natives, which, fair. Um, and also any French or Spanish settlers who happen to still be in the area, because the war's over and the French left, there's still settlers hanging out that are more than happy to shoot at the British. Um, and the bigger colonial governments want to tax these people for living out there, but not supporting them with infrastructure and like military support, or giving them a vote on like the colonial council back in the capital. So, like, why should we pay you taxes if you're not going to give us any help or any sort of voice? Like, that doesn't make sense. Like, taxes are for, which again, like, we're going to get into taxing stuff with the British here in a minute. But, like, a lot of people these days are like, oh, taxation is theft. It's like, yeah, well, taxation goes to, like, building roads and stuff. Like, I mean, as bad as our roads are anymore. But, like, if you want roads, we need taxes. If you want a fire department that you don't have to pay a subscription to not let your house burn down, we need taxes, like that sort of thing, public works. But these local government, or the colonial governments, weren't even doing that. They were keeping the taxes and using them for, like, the big cities, and the people on the frontier were just being taxed because they were in the colony. So in 1771, the governor of North Carolina sent the militia to put down the regulators. And again, if you're not familiar with that verbiage, most of them were killed because they refused to pay what they saw as unfair taxes, which these taxes were being used to build a ornate manor house for the governor. So, yeah, I probably wouldn't want to pay taxes to build a manor house for this asshole that we already hate. So, yeah, screw him. Turns out, though, Herman Husband got away, and we're going to see more of him later on. So, he's still around. And if you've ever played Fallout 3, regulators should sound familiar. Well, I guess depending on how you play Fallout 3. So we've got the Green Mountain Boys in council. This might be later on because, like, the big thing they're famous for in the Revolution, they attacked and took over Fort Ticonderoga, which is this fort north of Boston, and were able to capture the cannons there. And the said cannons were then later used by George Washington to force the British out of Boston. So, like, they were a major player in the early stages of the Revolutionary War. And this might be depicting, like, their plans on trying to take this major fort, but this is still them. This is still the Grey Mountain Boys. And here we have the regulators. I like this dude getting pulled away because he's about to punch a guy in the face. Very, very North Carolinian. Very just Carolinian. All right. So, this next section, post-war British policies, and then it says also in colonial unity, because when you've got a common enemy, it's easier to put aside your smaller differences and work together against what you consider a bigger problem. So everybody was annoyed about the proclamation line not being able to move west of the Mississippi. Not west of the Mississippi. That's where the Spanish are now. Not being able to move west of the Appalachians. Um, and hey, look, impressment is still around. I told you guys that wasn't going away. Now, I also did get ahead of myself a little bit when I was talking about impressment last time. Um, Actually, let me make sure that my... Okay, sometimes my mic gets turned off, or it gets turned off in OBS for some reason. Anyway, typically those that were impressed were sailors and poor men, and they were the only ones that tried to resist because they were the ones getting grabbed. But they were like the bottom of the social ladder, so most people just ignored it and went about their business. But as time went on, you had merchants who are more middle class joining in to fight off the Royal Navy and get them to leave these guys alone, which is more solidarity than, because the merchants aren't getting grabbed. Merchants aren't going to make good sailors. And also, like, merchants have ties with other people and other higher-ups that would cause issues. You know, the sailors and poor men, they don't have social ties. Not really, not typically. Like, even if a sailor had like ties to a rich family, if he was a sailor, he was probably like the prodigal son that was kicked out of the family and was just trying to get by, and his family wouldn't claim him anyway. So during the 7 Years' War, for example, the British cordoned off New York City entirely. Went through taverns and hauled in sailors and poor folk. And the next day, residents rioted at the docks. They completely overwhelmed the British sailors, the British Navy, and it got so bad that you actually had people in power, people who had political authority, petitioning the local, or at least the royal government in New York, to maybe be a little less heavy-handed with the impressment thing. Because again, this wasn't something that was unique to the colonies, or not to, I mean, to the North American colonies anyway. This happened everywhere. This, because Britain was a big empire. Britain had a lot of land all over the world, but also a lot of seaports all over the world. So they were grabbing people, you know, from, see, what did they have in South America? Like Falkland Islands, I guess, maybe by this point. From the Falkland Islands to India. Maybe they had Australia by this point. I don't know exactly when it was they grabbed Australia. People in England weren't safe. They grabbed people in England, which I've actually got an image of. And even after the war, they were pulling people onto ships because because once again, they've got a huge empire that they've got to keep safe. They've got to keep ships out on the ocean to maintain some level of security and authority over this huge empire. And even if they're not constantly fighting somebody, their sailors are dying, because being in the Royal Navy sucked. I'm sure I know I've said this. It was like 50% mortality rate on these ships, just from disease and, you know, the food going bad or the water going bad or just whatever. I mean, you know, that's why there's the whole, like, there's like that's why a lot of the pirate insults are like scurvy this or scurvy that. That was a very real disease you'd get on a ship because of lack of, like, vitamin C. and your teeth would fall out and stuff. Um, yeah. So, impressment continued. Impressment will continue until morale increases. And so, people fighting back against impressment continued. So, at least within the North American colonies, um, there were varying degrees of support from officials. Some officials were like, well, we're good British citizens, so we're going to work with the British and help them do what is the British law, because as you'll hear people say even today, well, it's the law, so you got to follow it, even if it's morally repugnant. So they'd work with British policy. Others tried to sort of work with both sides, so they'd, you know, be friendly with the British, but also try to ease things with the regular people as well. And others worked with the middle and lower classes to fight back against the British. They'd make it harder for the British to come in and just grab people off the streets. Because, I mean, that's a bad look, just authorities coming in and grabbing people off the streets for no reason. I'm talking about the British, by the way. Yeah. Also, there was the issue of the British being stationed in colonial homes, which was stated to be for protection, to protect the colonists against the natives and French on the borders, because again, while technically the French had pulled out of the region, there were still plenty of French settlers in the area that was formerly French that were more than happy to stir up trouble for the English. And there were plenty of natives who had been there for hundreds of years, that had been fighting the British for quite some time now, and they weren't just going to be like, oh, well, I guess we're friendly with the British now. That's just not how it works. I mean, it again, just kind of thinking back to some of the Empire Builder games I've played, and when you take over a region and there's still, like, people in there, they still hate you. And you've got to work to, like, get on their good side before you can continue expanding, because you've got essentially enemies behind your lines now, and you need to placate them before you can move on. The British didn't do a very good job of that. However, having soldiers stationed in colonial homes also was really good for ensuring that impressment was enforced and that smuggling was stopped. Because if you've got soldiers, not even just in your home, but like in the neighborhood or like right down the street, it's going to be hard to go out and resist guys getting grabbed on the street. Again, it's weird to imagine a government sending troops into its own cities, to cow the citizens, like some kind of occupation force. It's weird, It doesn't seem like something you'd ever consider anymore. Anyway, so here's the press gig in New York. You've got guys here they've grabbed this guy here. They've clearly beaten him a little bit. They're dragging him out. Guys here are prepared to fight back. I mean, they've got a knife. This guy had a knife too, but they knocked it out of his hand. They're getting ready to fight back, and the guy here is standing in the doorway with a gun. He's like, yeah, matchlock beats, or probably a flintlock. Gun beats knife. So, go back and sit down. A couple things I need to mention here. This is from Harper's Weekly Magazine. we are going to be seeing a lot of Harpers going forward. They are such a good source for just like stuff that's happening during the time period. Now, granted, you may notice also this is Harper's from 1882, which is like 150 years after the time we're currently talking about. So this was Harper's Weekly talking about a time period prior to what they're actually illustrating. So clearly, they weren't talking about press gangs in 1882 because they didn't dress like this in 1882. 1882 is post-Civil War. I mean, this was like 1882 was stuff that was happening in 1882. Like this was like the time of Edison, is what we're looking at. Like Industrial Revolution stuff was 1882. So yeah, this is clearly they're talking about stuff that was happening in the past. But anyway, point being, Harper's Magazine is really good. We're going to be seeing a lot of that. This image is from the book. This is happening in Britain. Well, for one, the picture in the book is in black and white, so I managed to get one in color. Go me, I guess. But also the picture in the book, it's not cut off up here. If it were to go up a little bit further, you'd see that this building back here has spires. It's a castle. So this is happening in Britain. The book here says, this 18th century engraving depicts the harsh impressment of men into the British Navy. Set in England, this illustration shows that impressment was widely practiced at home. Thus, the British government did not single out colonists for special mistreatment. So, yeah, I mean, there were poor people in England that were treated just as bad as, poor people in the colonies. The colonies were just part of England, and therefore were just as mistreated as the poor people in England. What's a couple of things I would like to particularly note about this image. Dude's about to get domed. You don't come along, you get knocked out and dragged onto the ship. Typically, they would have like their sisters or wives or whatever trying to beg the guys to stop. That very rarely helped. I don't know why they have a hobbit, but that's all I can see. Is they are stealing a hobbit to put on the ship. If I recall right, hobbits don't swim. I remember Sam having a hard time swimming. But they can cook, so maybe he's going to be their cook. I don't know. So, opposition to the British did bring people together. It brought people together across class lines, lower class, middle class, and sometimes even upper class would come together in their opposition against what they saw as British overreach. But it typically remained local for a couple of reasons. One is there was very little communication and transportation between the colonies. As I've said several times, there was very, very little in the way of like land transport between the colonies. If you wanted to go from Charleston to did Richmond exist? Let's just say Jamestown. If you wanted to go from Charleston to Jamestown, you took a ship. If you wanted to go from Charleston to Savannah, you probably took a ship, even as close as they are, relatively speaking. There was probably a land route between Charleston and Savannah, but it'd be easier just to take a ship. And I feel like it's mostly psychological, but I feel like when you go out on a ship, you feel like you're going to another land, even if it's all connected. But it was difficult to create a sense of common purpose because they felt so separate from one another. If there was news that came out of Boston. Oh, they're rounding up people in Boston and forcing them onto ships. Nobody cared. It's like, okay, well, that's Boston. That's not us. That's a whole different colony. It would be like for someone in Virginia hearing that people in Boston are being rounded up and forced onto ships. That'd be like hearing people in Australia are being rounded up and forced onto ships, or people in, I don't know, Argentina or Ireland. It's like, whatever. That's not us. Who cares? Ironically, it was the Great Awakening that helped to bring people together, despite the division that it often caused among churches. By the end of the 1750s, for example, we had the separate Baptists that were a group that split from traditional Baptists. Once again, the British are so good at naming things, which, as I told my class yesterday, I agonize over naming things. From my cats to my characters in games to anything. I'm like, man, I need to have a decent name for stuff, which I usually just get an idea and then just use a different language, so it sounds okay. But if someone actually knows that language, it's like, wow, that's dumb. It doesn't sound dumb to me because I don't know the language. But apparently, just ancestrally, I just don't have good brains for naming things, because look at this. Okay, we're splitting from the Baptists. What are we going to call ourselves? The Separate Baptist. Yeah, all right. Why not? We have the Methodists, which I've already told you guys about that. It's like, oh, they're just going by the Methodists. There's a bunch of Methodists. All right, we'll stick with that. You couldn't go with the Wesleyans because you've followed John Wesley? Sure, why not? Methodists. I don't know anything about the Dunkards. Or really much about the Moravians either. Moravians. Obviously, we got the Quakers. They all challenged social order. They brought in women, slaves, and free blacks into the revival, which, again, can't do that. And the anger that was often used in the Great Awakening against the colonial elites was very easy to shift to the British, because most of the colonial elites either were British, I mean, besides the fact that we were all British at the time, but they were either just from England overseeing the colony, or they were closely tied with England. So yeah, as we mentioned, the Great Awakening preachers were good at using these lines of communication, transportation to spread their word, like George Whitefield. As we're going to see in just a little bit going forward, the problems that the people were having with the British and their taxes and whatnot were soon spread through these same lines, these same communication and transportation lines. Another thing that I just stole wholesale off the internet. City of the Great Awakening, Methodists and Baptists were at the middle and bottom of the society. So there were lots of them because, the lower classes are always the most numerous. Introduced the idea of equality. Maybe. At least for the lower classes. Democracy spread. I don't know about that. Revival of religion, yeah, for sure. I mean, that's like the whole point of the Great Awakening. Some of this I don't know how much I can get on board with, but yeah. All right. Now, into the stuff leading. I mean, this is still chapter 5. Yes. What chapter I'm on? This is still chapter 5 because I mean we still got 30 minutes of class. My brain keeps going. It's 9:15. Time to end class. Like no, it's 11:15 is the time the other class ends. Okay. Try that again. Okay. This is when we really start leading towards the revolution. So this is, I distinctly remember learning this when I was in undergrad. Because again, this was something that we really were taught in high school. Because high school history is really simplified to the point of it being often incorrect. But there was this benign neglect. Basically, the British were just focused elsewhere. They were doing other stuff. They had to deal with India, which, if you're not familiar with the size difference in India and the American colonies, India is massive, both in terms of landmass and population. Good God, it's huge. I mean, even back then, like I know today it's like what the second most populous country in the world after China, and back then, I mean, it was the same. It was the second most populous country, the region, I guess, in the world after China. But also, like, it wasn't a single unified mass. It was sort of technically unified under the Sultan, but each prince could do what they wanted, and that's why the French and the British were fighting each other, because they were allying with princes that were opposing each other and using that to fight. So that's why. So the British were still having like issues within India to take control over it. Take control of it, rather. So they were busy. They also had, the whole Civil War thing we talked about earlier. They're constantly dealing with Ireland. The Glorious Revolution happened. They had to swap kings. They're dealing with a lot. And for the British, for the British Empire, a couple of colonies over here in North America that are producing, what, tobacco? Some lumber from up in the north. We don't really require a lot of oversight. We're pretty well behaved. So yeah, they left us alone for like damn near a century. And while this was going on, the colonies were pretty independent. Like, we were obviously still part of the empire, but we could kind of do what we wanted, which allowed for a lot of smuggling and a lot of domestic manufacturing. Now, the latter part is also pretty important. We know what smuggling is. But the domestic manufacturing was also not allowed. What that means is we were making a lot of our own stuff, a lot of our own cloth and Indian clothing, like pots and pans, just like manufactured goods, which we weren't supposed to do. We were supposed to send raw resources to England. They make the manufactured goods, and then we buy it from them so that they can continue to make money. And if we make manufactured goods, we can't sell that outside of the colonies. Like, we can't sell it to Spain, or definitely can't sell it to England, because they don't want us to make it. So when George Grenville was appointed as Prime Minister in 1763, this very much ended. He started paying attention to what's going on. Now, again, 1763 is when the 7 Years' War ended. England's debt doubled, and they needed to start finding a way to make money back. So we have the Navigation Acts. They prohibited smuggling, which, I mean, that's like saying, hey, don't do crimes. Smuggling is by definition a crime. So, like, I guess they just were like, by the way, guys, all that smuggling you're doing, we know you're doing it. Don't. We're going to start actually, like, paying attention now. It'd be like if, I don't know, eating in class wasn't allowed and I'd just been letting y'all do it, which, by the way, y'all can. I don't mind. I think it's up to the teacher, by the way. I don't care. But if, like, there was a school-wide you can't eat in class thing, I'd be like, by the way, guys, you can't eat in class anymore. Let's not do that. I don't want anybody to get in trouble. Yeah. That's all I can think of that. And with the trade guidelines, I'll show you an image of that in a minute. It's just like, got to go through London and get taxed this, and you can't send, like I was saying with the domestic manufacturing, you can't send stuff to other countries, and you can't even use other countries' ships, and it's a whole thing. It caused like a trade war with the Dutch for a while. Again, that's a whole separate class. Okay. Quartering Act kept troops in the colonies to enforce the policies. So, again, if you want to smuggle, if you want to, like, sneak stuff through the border, but you have soldiers in your living room, it's gonna be difficult. So, yeah, we got the Quartering Act of 1765. Sugar Act, American Duties Act of 1764. This put an import duty or tax on sugar, coffee, wines, other luxury items coming in. Also made it harder to bring molasses in from other powers, which again was the whole like smuggling thing we talked about. And this was all to make money for Britain. Because import duties, which any tax is money that goes to the government. By the way, I should mention, I'm sure, I mean, we've all heard, the Sugar Acts and the Stamp Act, which is coming up. Like the colonists were unhappy about these because they were unfair taxes and blah, 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 in America. Back then, you didn't pay tax on stuff. Like, you only pay taxes on very specific things. And when new laws were made for specific things, you would then pay taxes on those things. And these would be for, like, for example, again, the Sugar Act, American Duties Act. This was specifically to make money back after the war, because there was the 7 Years' War that had happened. And this would be a temporary tax for, I don't know, a couple of years. So you only will be paying tax on sugar, coffee, wine, other stuff coming in from England. But that upset the colonists enough that they started forming these committees of correspondence, where they would circulate their concerns through speeches, pamphlets, and petitions about the Sugar Act, and how it was destroying America and all this stuff. So yeah, which again, like I said, people are like, oh, taxation is theft. It's like, yeah, well, do you like having roads? Like, I get it, but also, we have public works for a reason. There is George Grenville. By the way, I mean, like, you guys don't need that, but I just like having pictures of the guys we talk about. Here's the Navigation Act. Just a couple of things that you have to do. For example, the hats, woolens, iron that are being made in America, you can't ship that to England because they're being made in England, so you have to buy them from England. So if they're being made in the colonies, you can't sell them, so they're essentially worthless. Although you can sell them within the colonies, but you wouldn't be something that you could trade globally. You can't export stuff on ships that aren't British, so you can't export stuff on Dutch ships, which there were a lot of Dutch ships. Cargo coming from other countries had to go to England first because it's got to be taxed, which really pissed off the Dutch. That's the whole thing. And if you're sending stuff out from the colonies, it has to go to England first to be taxed before it could go to other countries. So yeah, it was very. I mean, the whole system post 7 Years' War was basically owned by England. They were the economy in the Atlantic, which, I mean, they had the power. They could. It made things for us, the North American colonies, a bit more difficult. So the colonists responded in a number of ways. I mean, the book here talks about the committees of correspondence and people like writing about grievances and their concerns. And, you know, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, because I got to be careful, but, you know, we're living in a time with people having grievances and concerns, and, you know, folks talk about that, you know, oh, we got to make sure that we have peaceful dialogue, and you know, we're not destroying anything, and you know, the definition of what is peaceful and what isn't shifts, but whatever, depending on who's talking. And then we go back to the 1700s, you know, when our country was formed, and you know, this is like the classical age for America, right? So how did they respond to a tax? Well, not well. So they're out here beating drums and blowing horns, and they're hanging an effigy of Grenville back here, which was pretty common. I imagine, I mean, they've got another one up here on like a pike. I imagine there's some burning back here. That's what all the smoke is. They've got a sign here, the folly of England and the ruin of America. Remember, guys, this is one tax on, let me go back to it, sugar, coffee, wines, and some other luxury items. Like, not, this isn't income tax. This isn't like, you know, tax on being alive. This isn't property tax. This is like luxury goods you have to pay like a few percent on. Yeah, people are freaking out. Also, real quick, does anybody recognize this little hat? No. If you take my European history, you might. That is called a Phrygian cap. It is a Roman symbol for a freed slave, because back in, you know, Roman days, slavery was very, very common, but also it was usually like people taken in war, so it wasn't slavery like by race like it was here in America. So it was very easy to mistake someone for an escaped slave, because slaves were just like let go after a couple of years sometimes. So they would be given these caps to prove that they were set free. So this little hat represents someone freed from oppression, freed from slavery, which is ironic considering these are a bunch of white dudes being like, oh, we've got to be freed from slavery, freed from oppression. Yeah. You're going to see that a lot. The Phrygian cap is on a lot of state seals, especially East Coast seals, because we were the original 13 colonies. Um, so if you ever like look up state seals, especially for like Connecticut, or not necessarily Connecticut, but like Maryland and Delaware, and I think of Virginia too. The ones that are like really complicated with like people on them and stuff. There's a Phrygian cap in there somewhere. I don't remember if our state seal is more simplistic like our flag, but yeah, there's quite a few that are like that, and we're going to see those more because they were used also during the French Revolution as the same type of symbol. Anyway, and this is the British kind of responding to what they saw as the colonial militia, which is to say a bunch of backwoods hicks, or as they saw it, just a bunch of dogs growling, not really doing anything, not really meaning anything. Now, the Stamp Act, the one that I'm sure everyone's heard about. So, this was a stamp that was affixed to anything that involved paper, which, newspapers, contracts, playing cards, which feels weird. Like, paperwork, I get. Playing cards feels weird. I don't know. Diplomas, paperwork, which this and also the previous one, the Sugar Act, for the most part, only really affected the higher-ups, only really affected the rich. Because if you were poor, let me think about this real quick. If you were poor, you weren't buying sugar, coffee, wine, and luxury items. If you were a poor farmer just getting by, you weren't buying this stuff. If you were a poor farmer getting by, you weren't buying, hell, you probably weren't literate. Literacy, and I'm not saying that because poor people were dumb, literacy was really low back then. Hell, it's not especially high today compared to other countries. Relatively speaking, it's not as high as it should be. But like, especially back then, literacy rates weren't super high. So like, people in the lower rungs of society, which again was most people, wouldn't need any of this. Maybe playing cards, because you need to do something to keep yourself entertained when you're not out there working the fields. So that was probably annoying. But like, this was paperwork stuff. This was people who were rich, who had money, who were doing business. Also, this tax was specifically, let me see the thing here. The tax was collected by colonists appointed for the purpose, and the money was to be spent within the colonies at the direction of Parliament for, quote, defending, protecting, and securing the colonies. So, this was not a tax that was being made to raise money for Britain, because again, they had spent all this money on the war. It was specifically made to pay for troops for America, to train troops for America, to probably build more forts for America, and by again America I mean the colonies, and to keep the colonists safe. Like, this was specifically meant to be spent on the colonies. Obviously, quite a few people were against this. You had Patrick Henry, who was leading the Virginia House of Burgesses, who opposed the Stamp Act, a guy who we should know by name. Also, Samuel Adams, who led the Sons of Liberty, who was very violent. Let me just pull this real quick. At dawn, August 14th, Sons of Liberty hung an effigy of stamp distributor Andrew Oliver on a tree and called for his resignation. A mock funeral procession joined by farmers, artisans, apprentices, yada yada. The crowd carried the fake corpse to the Boston Stamp Office and destroyed the building. Demonstrators saved pieces of lumber, stamped them, and set them on fire outside of Oliver's house. Oliver, wisely, had already left town. His brother-in-law arrived on the scene to try to quiet the crowd, but only made them more angry. They destroyed Oliver's stable house, coach, and carriage, which they saw as signs of aristocratic opulence. 12 days later, demonstrators attacked the homes of Judge William Story, Customs Officer Benjamin Hallowell, and Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson. Battle against the Stamp Act unfolded all across the colonies with riots, beatings, and resignations reported from Newport, Rhode Island, New Brunswick, New Jersey, Charlestown, Charleston, South Carolina. They were violent. And so this was before the Stamp Act even took effect. It was like, hey, we're going to do the Stamp Act. It's going to take effect on this date. Excuse me, on this date. They announced it a year before it was going to take effect. So for a year, Samuel Adams and his Sons of Liberty guys, let's see if I can say this without getting black-bagged, did terrorism. They assaulted and threatened they threatened physical violence and did physical violence to the people who would be doing the work for the Stamp Act. So when the Stamp Act finally did come into effect, nobody was there to actually run it. It would be like if there was going to be a new tax next year, so some dudes just like attacked IRS officers for a year. So when the tax came into effect the next year, there were no IRS officers that went into work because they were afraid they would be killed. Samuel Adams was a terrorist, and so were his Sons of Liberty guys, and so were like most of the founding fathers. But I'll get to that later. They used terror tactics. So the Stamp Act Congress also came about during this time, where these affluent protesters petitioned to repeal the act. They said that taxation without representation was tyranny, which, fair. They were being taxed but didn't have a say in Parliament, but also that was the norm in an empire just in general. Like when Barbados didn't have representation in Parliament. Ireland sure as hell didn't. Colonies from England didn't have representation in Parliament because, well, Ireland doesn't really count because it's Ireland. But, the distance doesn't make it feasible for the most part. So, usually, it's the distance issue, but at least in terms of Ireland, they just treated them as second-class citizens. But there was also a rise in common American identity. So gradually, we're becoming less of a bunch of separate, disparate colonies, and more so gradually American. We're still going to be separate individual colonies even into the Revolution, and that's going to cause issues, which I know I've already said, but it's important. But yeah, by 1766, the Stamp Act was repealed. which it never even really went into effect. So, yeah. But here's the thing. Despite all of this, despite all of this, and it proving that the colonies had power to influence British decisions, there was no push for independence. There was no, we need to be independent of Britain so we can do our own thing, for a number of reasons. One, Britain was the most powerful empire in the world. Now, that wasn't so much because, hey, we can't fight this, but more so, hey, why would we not want to be part of the world economy? Because as we saw earlier, like, Britain is the world economy at this time, and we wanted to be a part of that, but we wanted to have our nice little special treatment part of that, like we had before. We've got this oh, the fatal stamp, all emblem of the effects of the stamp. Real dramatic, like, oh, the stamps, like it was like a 2% tax on paperwork. Whoa. If even that much. Oh, right. Y'all want to pick apart what's going on here? This is the Sons of Liberty with one of the stamp guys. They are pouring boiling water down his throat, and it's coming out his nose. So it's burning the inside of his mouth. They have tarred and feathered him. And by the way, tar is also like boiling hot, so it is burning his skin. And tar is like asphalt, but liquid. And then behind that, they've got a Liberty Tree with a noose in it, which is, they're not actually going to hang him, but they have threatened to. And then further in the back is the Boston Tea Party, which we're not to yet, but that's just, main thing is the tar and feathering and the boiling water. This was common for people who hadn't even done anything yet, for people that just so happened to work for the British government and were going to maybe be working to pass the Stamp Act. There's the Stamp Act Congress, just a bunch of dudes hanging around saying, oh, we don't like this. But they were all strapped because that was just the thing back then. They all had swords. All right, I'm going to do one more so we can be caught up with Tuesday, Thursday. I know we're getting towards the end of the class, but we can do this one. Declaratory Act. This was where Parliament said they had the authority to pass any law to bind the colonies and peoples of North America closer to Britain, which, okay, they passed a law that said they could pass whatever law they wanted. Neat. Seems weird. June of 1767, we've got a new Prime Minister, Charles Townshend. The Townshend Act, tax on items sent to the colonies, glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea, which, again, mostly luxury items. Glass, lead, paint, paper, most of that is considered luxury items back then. Tea was something pretty much everybody partook in because we're all British colonists, and everybody likes their tea. Obviously, this pissed everybody off. There were protests and boycotts. Samuel Adams was a big part of this. So the British sent 2 army regiments to enforce the laws because, again, it's a totally normal thing for a country to send the military into civilian cities if they are unhappy with what the civilian cities are doing. Totally normal thing, guys. It's totally fine, especially in a country ruled by a normal king. Um, Women were important with the boycotts as well because they were the ones that were buying the stuff. But what I definitely want to get to here is the Boston Massacre, um, where basically a crowd of guys were harassing a British soldier and throwing snowballs at him. He called for backup, and when more soldiers showed up, the crowd got bigger, and they started throwing rocks at the soldiers, and eventually somebody pulled the trigger. We don't know for sure if it was one of the soldiers or if maybe one of the guys in the crowd had a gun because, I mean, they're Americans. What do you expect? But somebody shot. And so the soldiers freaked out, and they shot. 4 guys ended up dead, including the ex-slave Crispus Attucks. So when you have the really racist weirdos where it's like, well, America was founded by white men. It's like, yeah, well, one of the first people who was killed in this whole thing was a black man. So, racist, whitewashing assholes. Anyway, the Sons of Liberty were the ones that called this a massacre because, like, if we hear today, they're like, oh, there was a massacre in New York. It's like, we're not going to thank 4 guys. This was very much a propaganda piece, and they used this as anti-British propaganda and turned the funeral into a parade around the city. Really weird to use, like, the death of people as, like, political propaganda. That seems distasteful. But I don't know. It's the Sons of Liberty can do it. And it was spread through the colony with the colonies, with the committees of correspondence. And this resulted in the townshend duties being repealed, except for tea, which is going to lead, obviously, to the Boston Tea Party. But we'll get to that next time. But before we do, here is a contemporary, it's an engraving of the Boston Massacre by Paul Revere. Paul Revere was an artist. The reason it's kind of, the colors seem like they're kind of bleeding is because it's an engraving on, I think, silver, and then they like oxidized it to do the colors. It's a different kind of art than like a painting. But yeah, so there's like a depiction from that era of the Boston Massacre, which again looks like these guys just like lined up and shot the crowd on purpose, when it was, at least as far as we're able to tell, kind of a panic situation, which I'm not going to defend soldiers shooting into a crowd of civilians, but also it wasn't like they marched. It was like, hey, let's shoot at some guys. So, yeah, it was a whole thing. All right, I'll see y'all, today's Wednesday. See y'all next week.